Morning, everybody. I am super excited to be speaking to you today about one of my absolute favorite things to talk about, which is staying organized. I realize that that is a little sad, potentially, but I think it's a really important topic to be talking about, especially at the start of your PhD. I appreciate that organization might not be your favorite task. So let's start with some myth busting. So the first myth is that you need to be naturally organized to effectively manage your time. For some of you, keeping your work organized might be something which happens without too much effort, but for others, you might feel that you are fighting a losing battle to stay organized. Thankfully, everyone can learn to implement time management techniques. And the aim of this presentation is to give you some of those techniques so it no longer feels like you're having to fight against that chaos all day long. Another myth is if your diary and notes aren't beautiful, they aren't keeping you organized. A simple search of bullet journal into Pinterest will either give you serious notebook envy or they will strike the fear of God into you. So let's get this straight. Your organizational methods should be functional before they become aesthetic. Your notes might be beautiful, but if they aren't serving their purpose, they aren't helping you at all. Don't get me wrong, I am a fan of color coding, and you'll see this later in my presentation. And if you're one of those people that's gifted with stunning handwriting, which I am not, please embrace that definitely, but only if your notes are actually doing their job. And finally, I'm better off just doing the task rather than wasting time planning it. Some of you might be thinking, I could be using my planning time to start my experiment or to read that article or to write a paragraph of my literature review. It's certainly a fair point. I don't want you to procrastinate your PhD by over-organizing. However, taking time to plan will save you hours on the task because it allows you to allocate time in a fair and well thought out way. It helps you to foresee issues and it will prevent procrastination and enable you to reach your goals. So why am I here today speaking to you all? Well, you might be feeling a little bit like this at the start of your PhD. You've just started your project, you're finding your feet. You realize that you've got quite a few different aspects of work and life to manage and balance. And you've discovered your PhD isn't quite as simple as introduction, lit review, chapters 1 through 3, for example, and conclusions. PhDs are multi-layered, multifaceted, multidimensional, living, unpredictable, erratic balls of chaos. And when I was where you were 2 years ago, I was so confused. But whilst I can't claim to have it all under control, and I do get it wrong often, I at least know how to tame that little ball of chaos, to allow myself the breathing space to think about the actual content of my thesis and the science which is at the heart of my project. So that's what I'm here to help you with. Let's start with the basics. So implement your organizational strategies now, because the third year version of you will be incredibly grateful that you did. And they will give you a very solid foundation to work from. Try out different methods and combinations and see what works for you. I'll give you tons of ideas today, but please don't do them all. Think of it as like an organizational buffet if you're at a wedding. And finally, don't be afraid to switch things up if it stops working. As your PhD morphs and adapts, so too should your strategies for managing it. So let's get set up. Filing systems. Love them or hate them, you're going to need one. And the way I do this is to sort my files from most frequently used to least frequently used and group them under different categories. So you can see I have one here for my PhD chapters, one for my study site, and one for my admin, etc. Don't laugh about how I do my numbering system for my folder names. I know it's highly unsophisticated, but it works for me. Exactly, like it doesn't need to be aesthetic, it just needs to be functional, as I was saying earlier. Make good use of subfolders under these, but don't go too crazy with folders because there's a fine balance between having too few and too many. If you find yourself constantly trying to search for things in your folders, then your filing system's not doing its job. I know many of you also will have had or may well have coming up a data management course where you'll learn about the importance of file naming. But to reiterate, for those of you who haven't done it yet, decide on a file naming template and stick to it. Making it clear what version you're working on at all times. So this is an example of a file that I've got down at the bottom here. The file name has all the information about what's inside, so I don't have to keep opening data files to find out what's in there. Next up is notebooks. The number one rule of notebooks is new project, new notebook. That doesn't mean I'm telling you to run down to Paperchase every time you have a new idea, but you'll want to keep each significant chunk of work separate like you would do in a filing system. There are benefits to keeping your notebooks digital or having a physical copy. In reality, you'll probably use both for different reasons. If there's a particular diagram or a set of notes that you know you're going to want to access often and you work in different places, I suggest scanning those pages and inserting them into a digital notebook so you have them at all times. Besides the obvious, meetings, diagrams, notes, I also use my notebooks for conferences because I need to keep notes to keep myself awake, and because then I can refer back to them if someone says, oh, I think they mentioned that in a conference in 2001 or something. Not that I was around 2001. Okay, next up is think about spreadsheets. These aren't just for data, so non-scientists, please don't panic at this slide. See Joanna's face is like, ha ha ha, Excel. Funded or self-funded, you're going to want to set up a spreadsheet for your budget. And this should itemize the cost, the item, the event that was for, or if it was for a particular tranche of lab work, the date of purchase, the date you're actually using it. That's mostly for things like train tickets or flights, and also the budget that is coming from. If you have different grants, you have different funding sources, you have different budget codes. For example, you might get a pot of money from your department for a specific conference, which have its own budget code attached to it. Finance systems can get a little bit confusing, so keeping a track of it all in one spreadsheet is really, really helpful. I also pop any extra pots of money, any pieces of income into my budget spreadsheet in a separate sort of sheet so that I can see at any point exactly how much money I have, and I can send that directly to my supervisor if he asks at any point to see it. Spreadsheets are also super helpful for progress trackers, and I use this to motivate my lab work, which has loads of steps, but you can also use it to track your reading or your data collection or interviews. I suggest you set up a little progress bar like I have down in this corner to see how far through you are. This can really help you when you've got a lot of steps to get through and you're not feeling particularly motivated. I'm 97% of the way through my lab work, so I am really desperately close. Okay, so now you're all set up with the basics and you start getting given or giving yourself tasks to complete. How do we deal? First up, it's everyone's least favorite app, email. Firstly, it goes without saying that get that folder structure set up ASAP, and if you can, match it to your file structure. That makes it much easier for you to become familiar with where everything is stored. My number one rule for managing your inbox is to aim to hit inbox 0 every day. I know this might feel like a pipe dream, but there is the easiest way to make sure that your emails don't build up and you don't miss anything and you get to feel super smug. So here's how I do it. If a useless email arrives in your inbox, mark it as read and then delete it. Be ruthless. You're going to get stuff which is not useful at all for your PhD and it just goes straight in the bin. If an email arrives that doesn't require any action from you, but it's useful to save, pop it straight into the right subfolder. Easy peasy. If an email arrives and there's a task in it which takes less than 2 minutes to complete, do that task right away. Just straight away, you get the email, you see the task, you think, oh, I just need to email this person with this one question, just do it, and then file that email away. And also, if an email arrives and it requires some action, which takes longer than 2 minutes, put that email task on your to-do list and then file the email until you need it. Don't use your inbox as a to-do list because it will get out of control really quickly. And that brings me on nicely to to-do lists. Everyone has their own way of doing this, but I split mine into two. I have an electronic to-do list in Outlook, which covers my long-term goals, big projects, and deadlines, and allows me to keep track of them. And I have short-term to-do lists in a notebook, which I use to assign my tasks weekly. It may seem pretty obvious, but you can edit digital lists, but it's much harder to edit something that you've written on paper with a pen. So don't use your long-term lists to store stuff, which is probably going to change very quickly in the future. And secondly, write everything that you don't want to do or the tasks that you find hard to motivate onto a page with a pen and use that as a motivation to get that task done. So I find this is much more helpful with things that I really need to send that email this week. Write it in your weekly to-do list. Every week, probably on the Friday before the start of the next week, I use this long-term list to decide on what small tasks I need to complete in order to move each of my projects along. And you can see sometimes here I use a daily to-do list like this one. This was induction week, but I do prefer a weekly to-do list like this, where I split internship, labs, other admin, because it gives you the flexibility of not achieving something every single day. For example, if you feel unwell, and it allows you flexibility if something urgent crops up. If something doesn't get done, just rolls over to the top of next week's list. And the final section of my presentation today is managing your time. Long term, I find the best way to manage your time is via a Gantt chart, which your school or institute might encourage you to use as part of your APR in the summer or autumn. Gantt charts are a great way to visualize what your priorities will be during different months, but don't worry if you don't stick to it, because they will change and adapt with your PhD and when new deadlines come up. This is more of a reassurance that you are on track, and also a way of keeping your eye on that finish line. And possibly the most powerful tool in your arsenal is your diary. Again, these can be digital or physical. I used to be a physical diary kind of person, but I found during lockdown that things moved around so much that I needed to switch to online to stay flexible. Diaries allow you to visualize how you're using your time, and I suggest making use of color coding options to see at a glance if you aren't getting your balance between tasks quite right. If you find yourself working in different locations, try using these all-day events to block out your time. So see on this Thursday I was at Circ, and then Friday I was at home. It's also a great place to store Zoom links, room information, meeting minutes, and anything key that's relative to a specific event. I also use this to plan my breaks, my annual leave, and my social time. So you can see I was calling my friend Helen on that Tuesday evening. I find that if I had a home and a work diary, I got confused. So I just keep it all in one place. But if you prefer the separation, it's also possible to have two separate calendars. I also thought this might be a useful place to mention a few productivity techniques which can help you to manage your time. So the first one is prioritization by urgency. On your to-do list, you put a number 1 next to the most urgent tasks, then 2, and then 3. Then you do all the number 1s, then you do all the number 2s until your list is complete. Eat that frog means do the task you dislike first thing in the morning. For me, that's writing. I hate to write. So I have to get up and I get dressed and I sit down at my desk and I write straight away. And then I can enjoy doing the tasks that I actually like later on in the day, guilt-free, knowing that I've already done the thing that I find the hardest. Body clock means you take notice of when you're best at certain tasks. I am terrible at lab work in the afternoon for some reason, but great at data manipulation. That's just the way that my brain works. So I allocate my time based on when I feel I do the best work. Time blocking leads on for that. That means you set aside a certain number of hours to work on a project and you don't do anything else in that time. You can use timers. I also use the ambient study music on YouTube if that helps you. And finally, Pomodoro, which is essentially working at intervals and taking strict defined breaks. Lots of people find that working in these short bursts helps their productivity. So that brings me through to my take-home messages. Firstly, keep it simple and logical. Don't overcomplicate the process. It should be a support, not a time drain. And remember that I have had 2 years more time to figure out things. So if you look at my spreadsheets and my diary and think it's quite far ahead of where you are, please don't panic. You will develop your own personal systems. Think about your tasks on different scales, daily, weekly, monthly, seasonally, yearly, and don't forget to check in with your long-term goals. And finally, I hope I've given you a spread of options here. So experiment and see what works for you. Thank you very much.